right, welcome everyone to our Food for Thought speaker series. We're honored to have our two distinguished guests, Francisco Pineda and Aiko Muna, to be discussing building New York City back better. As always, if you have any questions, we'll save that to the end, or you can put it in the chat. You could raise your hand in the participants tab. We can call on you directly. We can just ask your questions that are in the chat. Please keep yourself on mute unless you're speaking, asking a question. And join us for our Food for Thought. We've been going for almost a year now. We're glad to see everyone here. And I'll hand it off to Bill so he can do the introductions. Thank you, Francisco and Ike, for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Valerie, as well for keeping hope alive. Every week we get together, and in the dark days of COVID, it was really a warm, safe place for all of us to look toward hope in the future. And now that the future is hopefully just upon us, we have two gentlemen today who are going to be in the forefront of rebuilding America and hopefully the world as well. So thank you both. Just brief introductions for both of these just fabulous public servants and good people. Francisco has been with us once already in the series. He's a faculty member here at Columbia. He runs the Master of Science in Construction Management in the School for Professional Services. He is a 20-year veteran of the real estate industry and construction. He's an expert in strategic planning. He's an expert in troubled properties and reviving them. He's worked in the private sector. He's worked as a consultant. He's taught for many years. He served on the Infrastructure Policy Committee for the candidate Biden, now President Biden. He's been involved with the World Economic Forum on infrastructure, the Urban Land Institute, the Turnaround Management Association. He has been a leader here at Columbia in the MWBE initiatives, particularly around the new campus, and involved in the revitalization of LaGuardia Airport, the MTA, and many other projects. Ike, as we were talking before the session started, is one of the few people I've looked up on LinkedIn who has himself between two former presidents. So you can tell a lot by a guy like that. Ike is a member of the new administration. He's the director of the Office of Public Affairs of the U.S. Economic Development Administration. He has a career that spanned Columbia as a lecturer. He's been a policy advisor to then candidate Biden. He's done global public affairs for the private sector, Rockwell Automation. He's been on the board of directors of a nonprofit, St. Francis Foundation in San Francisco. I'll forgive him. He as all of us, he got off the track for a little while. He went to Harvard, but fortunately it was a term-limited master's degree program, so he escaped, and I think he's normalized since then. He also has a law degree from the University of North Dakota and a bachelor's from Morehouse College. These are two just dynamite people, and credit to both of them. They are intimately involved in the new administration. And hopefully leading us, now that we have the stimulus in place, hopefully infrastructure is next. And we've needed an infrastructure program for a decade or more. And I think this time we're going to get it. So I'll turn it over to Francisco. Again, thank you, gentlemen, both for joining us. Ike is actually at work, and he's going to have to leave us to go back to work, but he'll be with us for a while, and Francisco will take us through the whole hour. So Francisco, please.
Thank you, Bill. Ike is being called by a higher authority. I want to thank him for being here with us in the Picker Center, for hosting us, and Bill for that warm introduction. A couple of things just to highlight. Ike and I are both going to be speaking about our own opinions. They do not represent that of Columbia, of the program, the US government, or any other body. These are just very much our personal views and positions. And more than anything, it's an informal chat about how we see some of the linkages between career creation, growth, infrastructure, and policy. One of my favorite topics, I don't know, today we can call that a topic, many topics into one topic, but the complexity of today's systems and how they are integrated into society. One of the things that I think we want to situate today's conversation in is what's going on at the policy level, big picture, and then kind of drill down to a specific market. I'm going to talk about construction as a sector. I think it's often called an industry. Some people would argue it's a sector, not an industry, and how we can sort of shape policy from the federal and state levels down into actual municipal activity, and how that can create great jobs, both union, non-union, and career jobs, not just service jobs. And I think Ike's going to speak a little bit about his experience, both at Rockwell, in his career as an attorney, in his career as a leader in sort of heavy, light, and advanced industries, and how he sees some of this play out. Ike, do you want to say a few words about yourself, and then we'll go into a little discussion?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. I appreciate both introductions. I'd love to give you guys a quick overview of the EDA. I like to say we're one of the best agencies that no one has ever heard of. We give out grants to local communities, and those grants can sometimes be for broadband. They can be for construction and infrastructure. They can be for teaching facilities. So as long as you are a local community, some sort of political entity or nonprofit, you possibly can qualify for an EDA grant. The EDA has grown tremendously over the last few years. If you say 3 or 4 years ago, our budget was, 300 million. With CARES, we had to give away $1.5 billion. And as a matter of fact, tomorrow we reached the $1 billion milestone. So we've done $1 billion in grants, and these are to local communities. And sometimes they're $700,000, $800,000, $60,000, and sometimes they're several $1 million, and they have a fantastic impact on those communities. I will say that for every dollar we invest in critical infrastructure, we see a $17.50 return. Which is just amazing with the amount of dollars that we have. During my time at Rockwell has a fantastic program called the Academy of Advanced Manufacturing. And the CEO decided that he was going to do something to give back. And so what we do is we take veterans, newly returning veterans, and we give them 12 weeks of training. They pay for their housing, they pay for a stipend, and then they place them into customers' shops. So Rockwell, for example, any manufacturer almost in America is a customer of Rockwell. So we train them on our equipment for 12 weeks, and then they're out. And a lot of these jobs were starting in the $50,000 to $70,000 range, which can really change a life. Many people come out of the Army. They don't have skills that necessarily align in the private sector, and they find themselves in roles that in hourly, low-wage jobs with low skills. So it's been a fantastic program. So would like to talk a little bit about both of those, and also open to questions while I'm here on my thoughts about how important infrastructure is going to be to moving America forward and helping us compete against in a global economy.
Thank you, Ike. So with that in mind, let me maybe just frame this quickly. One of the big issues that I've been thinking through is that while GDP is a fantastic statistic and metric, it does limit our understanding of certain sectors and industries, because what it does is it measures receipts, sales, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't measure the interlinking and systems level workings and dynamics of different sectors and industries, and job creation as a result. One of the big focuses that I've been on is understanding the impact of construction. And when you actually look at the GDP statistics, it's about 4 or 5% of national GDP, which makes it seem like it's not as important, right? Finance is in the 20-25% range, healthcare in the 10 or 15% range, and so on and so forth. And I think what it misses is that you might have a large economic impact by the financial industry, but you don't have that same translate into actual jobs and employment. And what you also may not have is the path to the middle class or the path to a career necessarily in some of the more numerous, in some of the industries or sectors that create more jobs like services, hospitality, and so on and so forth. And I think this becomes an issue, not just intellectually, but it comes from what I view is that the majority of policymakers and the public don't fully understand the extent and contribution of certain sectors that might not seem interesting or sexy or topical, right? And in my case, my focus, construction, I think is one of those most undervalued. And then when policymakers and the public begin to shape that discussion, it's rarely surfaced and it's rarely thought of as a engine of economic activity. Another one that you've come from is manufacturing and light manufacturing, right? We have this idea of the Rust Belt, whether in the UK or in the middle of the United States, as an aging type of workforce that is backward. But in reality, light manufacturing has been on the forefront of robotics. It's been on the forefront of hiring STEM students. It's been driving not just the research and the development, but the application. So when we think about the type of grant programs that you talk about from the EDA, when we think about the type of policies that allow us to compete internationally, oftentimes these two sectors are forgotten. There was a very interesting report that was done in the UK at the turn of the century called the Pearson Report that in fact mapped the network and systems level integration of construction in the United Kingdom to other industries. And it tried to calibrate the effect of sort of construction as a third level activity, right? First off, we've got macroeconomic indicators, then we have business cycles, and then based on those business cycles, we have the demand for construction. But it mapped how that then stimulated jobs and work and flow within light manufacturing, within the service industries, the accountants, the attorneys, the administrators that were supporting that activity, the regulators, the planners, and more, some of the technologists, whether you're using GIS systems to think of urban planning or assessment, where you're thinking of other regulatory and oversight jobs. So, having said that, and having kind of introduced this idea that perhaps, while it's very good to look at GDP and economic statistics as a way to understand the current state of our nation, of a sector, of a state and economic activity, what are your thoughts in thinking broader and more systems level across this? Especially, let's just talk about construction and manufacturing, and how through these two things, through these two sectors and activities, you can start creating careers and jobs like you did in the program at Rockwell and like we've done here at Columbia with the Manhattanville Development CU Grow program. If you can talk a little bit about that concept and what you've seen beyond Rockwell, or maybe dig deeper into Rockwell and kind of what you're hearing up there in DC.
Yeah, so happy to do that, and thank you. I'll talk a little bit, we'll dig a little deeper into Rockwell. I'm particularly interested in how we get people from working class into the middle class, or even sub-working class, if that's the title, into the working class, right? And so we're doing this right now through job training programs. We're doing this by preparing communities to be able to handle and receive business. There's, I believe it was Chobotny, and I believe they're in upstate New York. And several years before they came there, as I understand it, the town received an EDA grant for a new some type of water system. So we come in, we give them a grant. I think it's a matching program, and they're able to increase their infrastructure big business then comes in. Now a town that was once on the edge of falling apart, maybe on the decline, now has a major manufacturer, good paying jobs. Obviously, they're going to start building homes and new businesses. And so I think, when we talk about this at the baseline of building or the construction trade being an economic generator, economic boom, I think it just goes without saying that is completely accurate. When I go back to every dollar we invest is in an infrastructure program, we're seeing $17.50 return. I mean, where else? Wall Street's not getting those kind of numbers. I mean, no one's seeing those sorts of numbers. And we aren't also talking about how people's lives are changed. The president always talks about the dignity of work and what it means to go to work and to have a job, and what it means to, what does it mean to have a decent home or to go to work at a place that you're proud of. So no, we're completely aligned there. Francisco, did you have a question that you wanted to dig a little deeper on? Francisco?
Sorry. Yeah, you brought up the multiplier effect, and you brought up the 1 to 17. And I think that's an interesting number. Most of the reports I've seen and that we see circulating in the press and the popular press actually talks about a 2 to 4 multiplier, whether that's the American Society of Civil Engineers, whether that's the Economic Policy Institute or the Global Infrastructure Hub. I think that 17x number is absolutely more true in those longer term impacts. It's hard to run those longitudinal studies and really understand that systems level impact to careers and families that are able to not only have security of a job like that, but build those skills that are transferable and are longer term. Here in New York, and just talk about the industry itself, we forget that we have about a $1.2 trillion construction trade industry in the United States. New York makes up about a tenth of that, a little bit under a tenth between public and private sector. And when you think about any one job in particular, any one large job, take Delta with 5,000 employees at any one point of their peak cycles, which could last 2 or 3 years on a 7 or 8 year job, 8-year project. You're looking at 5,000 individuals that are not only learning to work together, building relationships, building network, building a community of practice, but the types of skills that then go from one job to the next. And I highlight this because one of my good friends and former alums, who was the youngest general superintendent, another Army guy, by the way, Armor, said to me, it's amazing that you can come out of school as a young engineer, as a construction manager, with no experience. You can get put on one mega project like ours, like the Columbia Manhattanville Development Project, or like LaGuardia or JFK or Gateway coming down the pipeline, hopefully, if our friends in DC get their act together, and can spend the entire career from cradle to retirement with a pension on that one job. I mean, that's amazing. That's really incredible. And then when you actually think about the impact of 4,000 or 5,000 people that have essentially security over 30 years, and obviously then improving our infrastructure, improving our flow, that's a pretty incredible, sort of story or narrative.
Well, yeah, I agree. And, when you looking, and I know the plan is going through the process, but we want to, building, new bridges and tunnels and new schools and clean energy. That's all going to have a great an impact on these communities, but in the sorts of, good paying union sort of jobs where people can build a family and really grow and sustain a country. And we talk about recovery. I think that's what we're talking about, is, creating. And sometimes you hear local mayors and they'll say, well, I have 500 new jobs I created, but they created 500 $9 an hour jobs. That's not going to do much for your community, right? But creating a good, solid blue collar job, whether it's solar, whether it's energy, construction, those are the type of jobs that, that people contribute. They put back into schools. They help build schools. They help build homes. And there's this domino effect. I mean, you can just see it. I mean, if you take these Rockwell guys, for example, a lot of them were vets. They came out, maybe they were an infantryman or, something that just does not translate, right? And they had gone to work at Big X Corporation, Big X Box at $10 an hour. They weren't using any of the skills they had learned, the valuable skills they had learned, their leadership skills. So we take them 12 weeks, then we put them into a well-paying job where they can support a family. In some cases, start on the track to buying a home. Again, these jobs start at $50,000. It means that that they end there. These are starting their careers in many ways. But these folks are now able to use their leadership skills. They're able to contribute to society in an entirely different way. I'm not sure how we actually put a dollar value on what the construction and trade industries actually do for our country. There are just so many folks that maybe college isn't the right fit for them, and that's okay. You don't have to go to Columbia or Harvard to be a great citizen and to be a great dad or mom and raise a family. So I'm excited about what the president's infrastructure plan can and will look like. I'm excited about the likely hundreds of thousands, if not more, of jobs it will create. How many homeowners will it create? How many new schools and new bridges will it create? And it's an effect that's going to last generations over and over. So Francisco, I think and I always thought you've been onto something about this construction having a much greater impact, and something we need to really peel back and really think about and put out there.
I want to be mindful of your time. I know we've got you for a few more minutes. I'm glad you brought up this, and not to get provocative, but I like getting provocative. Amazon, is a perfect example of the type of hype machine that had, in my opinion, taken focus away from the important policy making and to, the news cycle. And really, what Amazon did, in my opinion, was really not in the best interest of our social and economic growth, at least not for New York. I was personally glad that situation was sort of put on hold and blocked. But not to delve into that too much. I have one last question for you, and I think what would be helpful is to understand from you, how would you advise a firm? How would you advise an individual, somebody listening today, going into an organization like Rockwell or even Amazon, wherever, and say, look, and most of this stuff's done by lone wolves, right? Most of this, internal development program is done by the one or three people that, kind of take that initiative, learn that there's knowledge that can be structured and standardized, and want to sort of dissipate that knowledge. What would you say would be your advice to structure a program like you did in Rockwell? Maybe keep it high level. How do you get buy-in from seniors? How do you make that case that this benefits them? Do you focus simply on the bottom line, which sometimes that's your audience? They want to hear that this will benefit their retention, they will benefit their morale and thus productivity. Or do you focus on some of the ESG, which maybe is slowly getting more traction? If you had like a 5-minute elevator pitch to tell somebody, hey, I want to do this, Psych. I want to do this at Condé Nast. I want to do this at wherever. What do you recommend I do?
I actually pulled back to my time at Target for this, where I was head of global strategic partnerships, right? And it was a role where, essentially Target was trying to enhance its reputation in a particular country. It was India. We were having challenges there. And we had the buy-in. This was created at the very top. Listen, here's a business problem. Whenever you want to do some sort of good and you want the business community to participate, you have to be also solving a business problem. So Target had a reputation issue in India many years ago. And so we also had, and a part of that reputation issue was some security concerns around safety for employees. And so I thought it would be, and others thought it would be a good idea if we built relationships with some of the local police that would, certainly, ultimately what the goal was to build those relationships so we could see faster response, so our employees were safer. If they have if an employee feels safe coming to work, they can do better work. So we invested into helping the police build some technology infrastructure. So we used our own dollars to help the local Karnataka police build a public safety app and some other initiatives. But what I would say is, what business problem are you solving? Where is the win-win situation, right? So, this isn't charity, right? And I hear you, Francisco, on Amazon and what you're saying, but I think we have to peel back a layer beyond that. What has happened where communities feel like they have to literally sell themselves to the highest bidder for low wage or not great jobs in some cases, right? What are cities and towns doing just to get a stadium in there with $8, $9 an hour jobs? How did we, it wasn't always like this, right? This wasn't always the case. So I want to peel back and I want to understand, how do we get to a point where a city is basically willing to offer themselves, do what you want, have your way with us in any way you like, to XYZ company, be it Amazon or any company. And the jobs are important, but if they're not the sort of jobs that we just talked about, then they don't do the city or the state or that government any good. Again, you need jobs where people can buy a home and buy a car and send their kids to a good school. And so I hear you there. I just want to peel that layer back. But the foundation of my advice would be, what business problem are you solving through this partnership? And to the business, I would say you need to look outside of your four walls, outside, and look in your communities and see where you can help. See where you can if it's street lighting, that's one thing Target knew. If customers felt safe coming to their stores, they shopped more, they stayed long, they actually came into the door. So you'll see Target has some of the most well-lit parking lots, the best security system, in the private sector, great relationships with local law enforcement, great relationships in the community. These are all good for business. So again, what is the business problem that you are solving? And what problem can you solve in the community to help to enhance your reputation, to get more people in the door? So it's always going to be a win-win situation. If you're trying to get business and more people, then what can you do in that community? If you're a community, you want that business, what business problem are you solving? And I would say at 90% of the time, 90% of the cases, you can find some synergy. But I would love to explore with you at a later date how cities have arrived at this juncture where they're selling themselves to the highest bidder, and in some cases, it's not in the best interests of the citizenry at large.
Thank you for highlighting that, and I think you brought up an important underlying dynamic, this last point, which what has happened for us to get to this point where cities are selling themselves, or individuals and communities are feeling that they have no other option but to sign up and enroll into something that is short term. And I would only add to what you've said, which is great advice, is that part of the discussion is helping the private sector and really any sector, even the public sector that lives on an election cycle, to think more long term and understand that benefits might not be right out the gate, but when they come, like a power law curve, they will come at once. You need that ramp up and that investment. Ike, thank you for joining us. Ike's part of our faculty at the School of Professional Studies. He's going to be teaching with me next semester. We're excited to have him join. I was happy to poach him before Harvard got him back, or Wharton or Penn. I don't know why I always say Wharton because I went to B school as well.
Or Morehouse. Don't forget
Morehouse. Well, I'm thinking sort of Philadelphia, and yeah. All right.
Okay.
And by the way, we're happy to share you. This is an open platform. So
thank you. So, thank you, Francis. It's fantastic to be here. I do have a pressing commitment. I would like to stay, but thank you for this. And let's talk about peeling back that layer about cities and Amazon and companies like that.
I like that a lot. All right.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
So I want to stop, maybe offer a chance for folks to ask any questions. A couple of thoughts I had, I wanted to bring up, why I think part of this thinking and part of this policy analysis and part of this research is important, is to kind of what are the expected outcomes of, to Ike's words, peel back those layers, understand the dynamics between different sectors and different investments. And again, we're talking policy, but this also relates to investments. that you might make in your firms, that you might make on your own independently. But what are the insights and takeaways that can help inform policy and how certain regulation is applied and legislation is applied and what effect that has on the marketplace? One example is Article 15A in New York State that requires MWB participation on any public sector work. How do we ensure that there's an equitable distribution of that, 10 and 20%, 30% MWB component? How does that work in upstate New York, where you might not have the density and diversity representations that we have downstate? I think that's an important thought. And what are you choking out from those communities by having a law like that or regulation like that? Rethinking frameworks and measurements, and maybe even new conceptualization of how sectors, construction sector in specific, relate to other industries, right? How does activity in construction support light manufacturing? People forget New York City and sort of the New York metro area is a pretty strong base in light manufacturing, which makes up a lot of blue and gray collar jobs. Data and relational information that informs ongoing research and data collection. More and more, we're seeing pressure on elected officials to go back to data to show that the policy and the legislation supports the intended outcomes. Are we sort of capturing the right data? Are we making the right relationships between the data? Are we telling the right stories? Are they being misappropriated? In my case, what's the construction sector's real economic role and contribution to society? To Ike's point, not just to the economy, but to that societal cycle and career cycle and job creation cycle and well-being. And then I think lastly, I would say is, what's the cumulative socioeconomic impact of, and this is sort of a postmortem of policy and projects. What's that cumulative societal and economic impact of previous large-scale construction or infrastructure projects? It's exciting and sexy to go out there and build mega projects and be known as the infrastructures are, or what you will. But ultimately, did it work? Did that make sense? Why would we spend $10 billion on this project or $5 billion on another project? Was that necessary? Did that really cause the intended outcome that we wanted? And I don't think there's enough of that retrospective being engaged in. And I think lastly, to Ike's point, is really understanding not just numbers of jobs every year, but types of jobs and careers. And obviously with the PRO Act kind of back in discussion in government, and the focus on union jobs, and the focus of the unions versus non-unions, very important to engage in that conversation. I think personally that union jobs and the unions are important. I think they provide great careers. Is there room for reform? Yes, there's always room for improvement and reform. And I think there's room for both union and non-union activity. And I think they should be protected and supported equally. But I think these are important discussions because they do add value. And lastly, can we look at other countries for models? Is the Mittelstand German model a good one for the United States? I don't know. I don't think so. We're 6 times larger, much more fragmented, not as homogenous, but maybe it's something that can work at a metro level, right? Or at a state level. Maybe it is something that certain states that have competitive advantages in particular fields can double down and create sort of a mini Mittelstand type of policy that supports blue and gray collar work, trade work, apprenticeship programs. In fact, I don't know if you saw, but the Biden administration and the Department of Commerce just announced that they're going to be reinstituting their new apprenticeship advisory council, Department of Commerce, to support apprenticeship programs. So anyway, I'll stop there and take any questions if you want. If not, I'm happy to keep babbling on. I can talk for a long time.
So Francisco, let me jump in with a couple of points related to the very interesting propositions that you and Ike have laid out. couple of things. One is you think of the history of construction and mega projects in the US. I would say from a long perspective, the best money that government spends is on infrastructure, because despite the time and despite the cost overruns and despite the corruption, nevertheless, the bridge is up there for 50 or 100 years and we use it and it generates private sector jobs, not just in the construction industry, but in all industries. So I'm a big fan of infrastructure because of its externalities. But the issue that you talked about a lot, and I think it's very difficult, very controversial, and there's no easy answer, is does government dictate to the private sector, or do unions dictate to companies to say you got to pay a living wage? Or does government play a more, what I would argue, a more macroeconomic role? And very simply, what I mean is sort of what happened with the stimulus package. If government uses the tax system to say a living wage in New York is $19 an hour, but the local pizza shop can't pay $19 an hour, instead of money getting taken out of your check for withholding, it gets put into your check to bring you to the living wage, right? So instead of saying, you know, let's mandate this level, let's let the market work. And let's use the tax system and use it the way we use withholding. That is, you don't wait till the end of the year to get your money back. You get your money every week or every 2 weeks. Isn't that maybe a smarter way than going to war with private sector people? Yes, you need regulation. Yes, we need MWBE. Yes, government has to be there to make sure that private firms don't take advantage of people. But a big company can maybe pay a living wage. Great, they should. But a lot of small businesses can't, and they never will be able to. So how do we, so big question, but you're a really smart guy.
No, I agree with you. And this isn't my field of expertise, but I think that I have not personally been in support of setting a minimum wage nationally. And part of the reason is less philosophical and more practical, which is there's just different needs and realities across the spectrum. Every location is different, and every employer and every service type is different. I don't think, and I agree with you, I don't think this is something that should be mandated from, certainly not the national government. Maybe this is something that can be mediated and explored more deeply. And I think we need a lot of research, but I think that needs to happen at the local level, maybe at the municipal or at the state level. And I do agree that there's far better mechanisms. And I think what you're talking about, that those are, you know, by just slapping on a minimum wage, you know, you start getting into this constraint, you start constraining the ability for flexibility or different types of experience. There's just enough value that, you know, you can get a lot of value doing a job, and that you can learn a skill, you can learn a trade that perhaps, you know, like an internship, and maybe that can be time bound, but it's certainly not pro-growth by putting this cap that you can apply across everywhere. I also think that using the tax system is a better way of figuring that out, of finding the type of support for small businesses or services to ensure that there's a minimum standard. Within construction, I think it's a little bit more complicated, and I'll talk about that for a second. I do think prevailing wage is an important mechanism, and I think the unions play an important role in setting standards and training. And I've seen this on union and non-union jobs, not across the board. And I'm not here to paint on all union jobs as not being up to par. But, you know, I've been enough to see that some smaller non-union jobs are executed in a way that exposes the community to a lot of risks. They don't follow procedures. And part of that is they're not trained. The owners are not forcing them to go through licensing or training. They don't have the standard support systems in place. So I think this is a complicated question, and I think it requires some real research, and I think it should be almost done sector specific. And this is maybe where the associations that represent these industries and sectors can play a role with both, employer associations and industry groups and chambers of commerce to say, hey, we looked at this. Here's what we think. Here's what the data is showing when we think about living wage and minimum wage policies. But I agree with you. I do think that, and I don't know, I don't have an answer on this. I think some things maybe at the federal government should stay macro and some should not. But I think it's a very complicated set of issues. And I think I think it kind of forces us to ignore the fact that there's sort of second and third order effects that we're not thinking through all the time. I hope that answered your question. I know it didn't, but
No, you're right. I mean, it's extremely complicated, but it seems to me if this country is going to fulfill its ideals, you can't say to people, you should work and support yourself and support your family. But work is not going to provide you with enough money to do that. I mean, so that's like a mixed message, right? Yeah. You tell me I should go out and get a job and support my family, but the job only pays $10 an hour and I need $18 an hour to live. It doesn't compute, right?
Yeah. Well, and the good question there is why do you need $20 an hour to live? Well, let's talk about New York City. One issue is housing. We've talked about this to some extent. And I think personally, and this is where I've done, quite a bit of research and have some background, I think one of the easiest ways to resolve the housing, and I'm not saying resolve it, but at least mitigate it, is to start thinking about the supply-demand relationship, because that's ultimately what it is. Taxing the millionaires and the billionaires on Fifth Avenue is not going to resolve the housing problem. That's nonsense, and that's populist talk with absolutely no evidence to back it up. London, Paris, Munich, they've all dealt with it. But why isn't Tokyo? Tokyo doesn't have this issue. When we're talking about, the 20 most developed economies and the large kind of peer mega cities, because they address it from a supply side. And yes, there's some pretty strong subsidies and some pretty strong incentives that they put, but ours just aren't working. And, the tax credits aren't working. NYCHA is a disaster. Again, I'm a big critic of NYCHA and the way that's being managed and governed. It's such a disaster. It's under federal oversight right now. Not even HUD wants to touch it. Is it just become too big to manage? So to me, if we can reduce some of those basic costs of living, transportation, if we can tie the centers of work and job to where we live and people live and have access to affordable housing because there's a supply and pro-growth type of set of policies, I think you can start bringing down that $18 or $20 an hour to more of a 10, more of a 12. So I think it's sort of multiple domains that support that.
I agree, but of course that one way or another involves us helping us, right?
Yes.
So Singapore, for example, takes a little bit out of your paycheck every week in a housing account and they match it. And by the time you're ready to raise a family, you have enough money that you can go out and buy an apartment for your family. And it's like 90% home ownership in Singapore. But people say, well, Singapore's small. Yeah, it's small, but it's the size of New York City. So if it can work for Singapore, it could work for New York. But yes, housing is a critical area. But you know better than anybody, in a large city in the modern world today, the cost of building and maintaining an apartment is more than the average wage earner can pay. The economics of it don't work for people in the lower half. So somehow, some way, the public sector has to get involved. Right now, I agree with you. I think while public housing is essential because we need the supply now, it's not the right way. It's not the best way to do it. I mean, if I were king, I would sell all the units in public housing to the people who live there. And I'd use the money to build more housing, right? And then everybody'd have skin in the game and everybody'd have something to leave their family.
Yeah, and we can actually look at successful case studies for that precise program. The UK did that in their council housing. And in fact, you brought up another important, I think this is so complicated because we're not thinking about the way we organize. I think you highlighted this American call it ideology around, meritocracy and hard work and low government and all this stuff, which is a bit of a fallacy, right? But I think at another level is how we're not really organizing in a way that that we can execute effectively. When you have 600,000 units run by NYCHA across all boroughs, this is a monstrosity. Nobody can manage that. Versus when you look at the London system, where you have local councils that manage council housing and then are able at that local level make decisions whether they will privatize or create privatization schemes to those residents, like what you described, and what they will hold themselves, what they will develop, partnering with small local developers that are building 100 units, right? Keeping those developers and those workers local, and you're sort of creating sort of micro markets that address micro needs versus trying to centrally plan for, a metro of 20 million residents or a population of 8 million, when you really don't even have the organizing levels that allow you to effectively do that, much less the policy making. I also think that we got drunk, and New York's a good example of this, and so are other cities in the US and internationally, that we forgot that ultimately as city leaders, it's our obligation to provide the services that will make this city livable. And I think there's a bit of competitiveness in this, which is for you as a city to be competitive, what are you offering? If you're making me pay, a premium of 2x to live in this city, but the services are, half as good as those of your competitors, why in God's name would I live here? We saw this, the pandemic already surfaced these secular trends we were seeing. Again, the popular press kept talking about everybody's moving to cities, everybody's moving to cities. No, guys, you got to look at the numbers. In fact, the opposite's been happening for a decade. People have been moving to middle, second-tier cities in the United States for the last decade. The type of people moving into cities have been I guess what the press calls the global elite, and what Fox News likes to call the global liberal elite. But really the working class, the families have been moving to Columbus, Ohio. They've been moving down to Charlotte, North Carolina. You're seeing this happening and I think ultimately it's a sort of statement that you're not delivering a livable city to me. Whatever it is you're doing, it's not working. And you need to think through how this is going to become livable, not just for me and affordable, but where I can build a career, where I can, raise a family, where there's parks. And I think, I don't know if we can do that at that major central command level, but I see the same failings in smaller cities. So I'm not sure. I think maybe this is an ideological problem. I think this is maybe a problem of short-termism that America has gone into, because the same failures are sort of at a lower scale present in small cities. Providence, Rhode Island how does Providence, Rhode Island have an affordable housing issue? How do, small cities in America have affordable housing issues? I mean, I don't understand that.
I have lots of things to talk to you about, but I could talk to you all the time.
Yeah.
Let's get
so we have a question
else in here.
Yeah, we got a question here from Noah. Offsite and industrial construction has many upsides, but do you feel that there are risks it will put too much downward pressure on higher wages, field jobs, and construction? Do you see potential harm in light manufacturing construction? So this is a very interesting question. The problem with New York is that the unions have been blocking the ability for any city or state sponsored project to conduct offsite construction. Obviously, there's all the private sector work that also does union work. So this has been an issue. Now, why is it an issue for them? Why are the unions been pushing back on more offsite construction? Obviously, because they feel this will move jobs from outside of the city and those trades to cheaper locations in Long Island or upstate or Pennsylvania. So how do you address this? I think, number one, I don't think it puts downward pressure on higher wages. I actually think what it does is it will produce better productivity, and it will allow for certain trades to actually level up in how they do their work. A good example is Boston. They ran into this same problem, and they launched a couple of pilot projects, construction projects with local unions and a few locals to build components off-site, while also ensuring that those unions were involved in that process. I forget the name of the company right now. I'll look it up while I'm talking. So again, I go back to references that have worked, that have been successful. hold on a second while I'm talking, I'll look it up. And again, this isn't new. The Japanese have been doing this for 30 years. The Swedes have been doing this for 30 years. To some extent, continental Europeans have been doing this for many years. And these are all very pro-union economies and political bodies. So, you know, they've been doing it well. They've been doing it successfully. And I think it's a question of engaging in a co-authored process with the unions and the public sector and the private sector and saying, hey guys, you know, we can do this together without undermining what you fought to do, what you fought to gain as protection of workers' rights and wages. But we need to do this so that we don't clog up our streets, so that we're not creating unnecessary risk exposures to the community. And so that, you know, we can all level up. This, I think, needs to be integrated into a programmatic policy and not just saying, oh, we're just going to build cheaper off-site, which has been much of the conversation. And I can talk about this for a long time, but while I talk or somebody else says something, I'll look at this example in Boston. We also have a question on climate resiliency guidelines. Well, we got local law 97 that is going to force most of the buildings in New York to become more efficient and to essentially become as efficient as LEED gold standard. I don't know how we're going to do it, to be honest with you. I'm a little scared of how that's going to be implemented and what those costs are going to look like. I think it's a short fuse. I think it's important. Our buildings are the most polluting and emitting elements in New York City, more so than you know, our surface transportation.
Well, Francisco, believe it or not, we're coming to the end of our time.
Oh, we are. Oh, gosh. Okay.
And I would like you perhaps to leave us with some big, encouraging, optimistic view about hopefully the upcoming Infrastructure Act at the federal level. Okay.
So I'm very optimistic, and I'm happy to answer anything else if you want to email me offline. Look, you know, our friend and my other mentor, Steve Cohen, on another chat said to me, friend, I'm more optimistic than you are. On the one hand, I'm not that optimistic. You know, we have not seen GHG emissions in the US drop by much at all. In fact, it's almost the same for the last 10 years. And the Trump administration was only there for 4. So you can't sort of blame that reversal on them. I do think this is a little bit of a ideological issue for us and an operational issue. I think that's changing though. I think the infrastructure plan is a very strong one. I'm a big proponent of it because for the first time, it actually looks like a strategic approach to how we build an infrastructure spending bill, how we link all the elements to that. 4 out of the 8 are focused on renewable energy. And for the first time, it's not just 4 ad hoc elements. It's actually R&D and early stage green energy technologies. It's supporting the transmission and distribution infrastructure. It's supporting the other end of the supply spectrum, which is generation and renewable generation, increasing wind and solar and other forms. And then this 5th one is the integrative one, which I think is really powerful, and that's investing in our electrical vehicle infrastructure, which even much of the auto unions and the transport unions have come up to support. And it kind of helps us in this transition to electric vehicle. One big part that I think is missing is, you know, without nukes, and you know, I've been a big proponent of nuke, how are we going to fuel all this increase in power needs? But it does look like we are going to get a strong infrastructure bill. It does look like we may have some bipartisan support of it. And it does look like the states are stepping out with equally integrated strategic infrastructure plans, irrespective of what's happening with our governor. His plan maps and matches well to the Biden's proposed plan. And I think that's great. We seem to have an alignment, and more importantly, we seem to have alignment across the agencies at the federal level that are important. You know, Obama's second term was a bit of a there was not alignment between some of the secretaries in Obama's second term, and not to get into those details, but between Walsh and Buttigieg and Ronaldo, those are the three: commerce, transport, labor. Those guys are aligned, and I think that's important. And I think for the first time, cities have empowered themselves to address this at a local level. I don't think we've always, not every project's great, but I think they're finally taking the lead with some of these laws and some of these memoranda, and the work that they're doing between cities at the UN level has been also an important way to. So I think it's happening. Maybe not in the next 5 or 10 years, but I think we're certainly on the right path. And maybe in the next 20 years, we might see a much more livable and resilient and sustainable way of doing business and building and supporting supporting that social development and economic growth.
Well, we'll have you back in the fall, and hopefully we'll see how well they're doing thus far. So
Yes.
Thank you again. Jeremy, I'll flip it back to you to close it up.
Sure. So thank you everyone for joining us. It's a very insightful presentation. I'm glad to have you, Francisco and Ike, as well. And as always, join us for our next Food for Thought. So thanks everyone for joining, and see you later.